Hello creeps! Andy here, and today I wanted to talk about the new Stephen King book, Holly. The new Stephen King book, Holly, just came out this year. Look at how absolutely beautiful this cover is. It feels very, very nice. I mean, come on, it's beautiful. But anyways, this book just came out and I noticed a few interesting things. So this is part of a whole series of books from Stephen King. This many to be exact. Yeah, when I looked it up on Goodreads, all of the books weren't listed under Holly. And so let me see actually if they've fixed it yet. Yeah, it says it's number 3 in the series. It is not. So anyways, I wanted to just kind of make a video. I want to go over how I feel about this book because I have a lot to say about it. I kind of want to give you, a quick synopsis of what it's about, but I also want to tell you what books you need to read before reading this one. And then at the very end, I'll just rank them all for you, all of the previous Holly books, so that you, have an idea of which ones I liked and I didn't. That's definitely more per taste, and I'll explain each one. But anyways, this right now currently has a 4.26 on Goodreads, and I'm pretty surprised. So let's start. I'll leave timestamps in case you just want to watch a specific part of the video, but let's start with Holly. So this is the character Holly Gibney. She first appeared in the first Mr. Mercedes series in 2014. So she's been around for almost 10 years. Yeah, wow, that's crazy. So Holly Gibney is a character that started and began in the Mr. Mercedes series by Stephen King, and she has since evolved and has her own title of a book. In this book, there's a woman named Penny Doll whose daughter goes missing. She doesn't know what happens to her. She goes to the police, and the police kind of just, blow it off and say, she probably ran away. So she ends up hiring Holly. Holly Gibney runs a, what does she call herself? An investigator, I think, called Finders Keepers. That's their investigator, their business. That's their business name. And so she ends up taking on the case and trying to figure out what happened to Penny Doll's daughter. It obviously evolves into a more complex story. The antagonists in the story are really unique and interesting. But I don't want to give too much away because I don't think it says all that much in here. Let's get into the other books in the series, and then we'll dive a little bit more into the Holly Gibney book because I'm also curious how you guys feel about certain things. Let me just bring you through all of the books that Holly Gibney is in. So like I said, she first appears in this Mr. Mercedes series. This is about a man who takes a Mercedes and drives it into a crowd of people, killing them, and nobody knows who did it. There's a retired detective named Bill Hodges, and he gets a letter from the supposed killer kind of taunting him, and so he kind of takes it on himself to investigate and try to figure out what happened and who Mr. Mercedes really is. Then she shows up in Finders Keepers. This is the next one in the series. This is about books from a writer who have been stolen, and a guy gets out of jail and tries to find the books. This one, we have the first antagonist of the first book comes back again. He makes a little appearance at the end of the second one, but he's not really in that one. So yeah, the Mr. Mercedes trilogy, I guess, doesn't really do it justice because the second one is quite different from this. But this one, he is back again, and this one takes a supernatural twist. And it's not just him killing people in the way that he has before. Then you have The Outsider. This is about Holly Gibney. She's more on her own in this book. She has a new group of people who are helping try to solve what happened here. This one, again, I don't want to give too much away. Let me just give this a quick read. They are pretty sure that there's this one person who killed people. Fingerprints are found, evidence is found. However, that person also has an alibi that's rock solid, so he couldn't possibly have done it. And so they're really confused because they have evidence for it and evidence against it as well. And it turns out again to be more of a supernatural take, which probably is still saying too much. But the thing about, well, I guess we'll get to that later. And then we have If It Bleeds. This is I think there's 4 or 5 short novellas in here. 4 novellas in here, and If It Bleeds is the one that has Holly Gibney in it. And it's kind of it feels almost like a footnote of The Outsider. It's almost like an addition to the outsider. So those are all of the books that Holly Gibney has appeared in. Now let's get back to Holly really quick, and then I'll fill you in on which ones you need to read. In the Holly book, it's interesting because typically if you're gonna pick up a book in a series, it will give you enough information to get through that book and not be too confused about the previous books in it. You know, like that's usually what happens in books that are a part of the series, where it's a book by itself, it makes sense by itself, and it kind of gives you the background information so you're not confused or you don't feel like you're missing out. But most of the previous books do that in a way to where you can kind of get filled in on what you've missed, but the book still feels whole on its own. However, I would argue that Holly's not really like that. One, it gives away absolutely the plots of Mr. Mercedes and If It Bleeds. It might give away other ones too. Those are the only two that I remember where it just definitely, absolutely tells you the ending of those books and what happens in them in this book. Bill Hodges is brought up quite a bit during this book, and he was in the Mr. Mercedes series. And so I feel like if you didn't read that and you don't know what happens, it's just kind of like a weird add-in that you'd be confused about. Another confusing thing is we get a little background information about Holly's mother and like where she is in her life in relation to her mom, and I feel like that also would feel like not a complete story if you just read Holly alone. There's a lot of stuff in here that doesn't feel like the story is complete in itself, but I feel like if you just picked up Holly and it's the first one, I feel like you're gonna miss a lot. Another thing is the character arc. You absolutely do not get a full character arc if you just read Holly. I mean, really, it takes 6 books to get her from where she started to now to where she is. And so I feel like you might not fully understand the character of Holly if you just pick this book up. Now, does that mean you can't pick up Holly and just enjoy Holly? No, absolutely not. I think that it's still a complete story in itself in like at least, you know, the pro and antagonist way. But I think there will be things that will leave you feeling incomplete if you just read the Holly book. So which ones do you have to read before you read Holly? To be honest, it's up to you. For example, if you do not care about the previous 5 books, you have no intention of ever picking them up, you don't care about the Mr. Mercedes trilogy, you don't care about the If It Bleeds novella, you don't care about that, and it doesn't matter if it ruins it for you, then yeah, just pick up Holly if that's the only one that you want to read. And obviously it depends, like if you don't want to read 5 books before you read this one, but you still want to figure out like where she came from, then I would say at least pick up the first Mr. Mercedes book so you can at least see where this character started from and what she's evolved into, because that character arc is one of the most interesting, complex character arcs. She goes through 6 books and she's very different in all of them. This is kind of the first book that she's out on her own and doesn't have anyone to really rely or depend on, which is huge for this character if you've read any of the other books. I would say the Mr. Mercedes book is pretty important just to see where she began. If you don't want things ruined, then yeah, you're just gonna have to read everything before this one. And let me tell you a few things that I was thrown off about this book, because I don't want you guys going into it thinking that it's something different and then being kind of thrown off the way that I was. And then we'll get into the ranking of all the books and I'll tell you which ones I did like, why I liked them, that sort of stuff. So in this book, it takes place in 2021. So it is smack dab in the middle of COVID. And I gotta be honest, and this is obviously a personal preference, but I do not want to read about COVID. Like, that just happened. The last thing I want to read about is vaccines and masks and staying inside, and I don't even want to think about it at all. I'm the type of reader that I enjoy political and social issues added in my books in more of a metaphorical sense or using literary devices, but not outright discussing them, especially something like this that just happened. And so I'm really curious how you guys feel about that. I read fiction to get away from the real world and not relive it. And that's kind of how this book was. So yeah, I'm really curious what you guys think, like how you feel reading a book that takes place smack dab in the middle of COVID, if it's interesting for you and if you're like excited to revisit that, or if you're like me and you're like, we just went through that, I don't want to think about it. I'm really curious. Otherwise, I really did enjoy the antagonist in this story. I also really liked seeing where Holly has ended up after all of these books that I've read. So I did really, really like the stories, I just didn't like where it took place, you know. I just didn't realize that it was going to be fully about COVID. So anyways, that's what I wanted to say about that, just to give you guys a little bit of more information. Now let's go through my ranking of the Mr. Mercedes books. Again, this is going to be all personal preference. I'll do my best to explain why I did or didn't like these books. I liked most of them, but there were one or two that weren't my favorite. The one that I enjoyed the least was The Outsider. Here's my issue, I think, with this one. I don't like when things start off feeling like they're going to be grounded in reality and then they take a supernatural turn. That's my own personal preference. I know that that bothers me. I was really, really excited reading this, and the first, you know, however many pages of the book, 50, 100 pages, I was like, oh, this is really cool. And then, yeah, it definitely takes a supernatural turn. Wasn't expecting it, wasn't prepared for it, didn't particularly love that. And I did feel like it just wasn't my type of supernatural story. And a lot of Stephen King books are like that for me. And so that's why I didn't particularly like The Outsider. The next up is either End of Watch or If It Bleeds. So probably I'll say End of Watch because this one really disappointed me. This was one of the books it's the third one in the Mr. Mercedes series. So the first two, grounded in reality, everything is normal, just a typical killer, nothing supernatural. And then you have this one that just takes a left turn. And you're like, you can't do that in the middle of a series. At least that's how I feel. I did not like the supernatural elements that were added in here. I thought they were a little silly and weird. And I was just so confused and thrown off by End of Watch. I'm still glad that I read these. I'm still glad that I saw the character development of Holly. And I'm still glad that for this particular one, I finished the Mr. Mercedes series. But I did not enjoy it as much as I enjoyed the other two. Next up, I would say, is If It Bleeds. Now, if we're talking about the other novellas in If It Bleeds, absolutely adored them, loved them. But like I said earlier, with specifically the Holly story, it just kind of felt like a footnote of The Outsider. And I don't necessarily know if it added anything to Holly Gibney's character arc at all. It really did feel just like a little addition to The Outsider, and because of that, this one was one of my least favorites. But because there were, you know, added stories that I enjoyed, I liked this book as a whole more than these two. I hope that makes sense. With each book, she gets progressively a little bit more independent, and maybe she does in If It Bleeds. It's been a while since I've read that, but it does seem a little bit like it's just kind of an addition to The Outsider, and I don't know how necessary in the long run of like the character of Holly, how necessary that one was. Okay, next I would probably say is Holly, because as much as I enjoyed the story, I just didn't really like the time that it was taken place. But yeah, it was interesting. I felt unique enough that it did add something, and there's so much too with the character development and where Holly is as a character that she really deserved her own book, I felt like. And so that was really cool to see her take that on and not really have too many people to depend on. Next in the series, I liked Finders Keepers. Although this didn't have anything to do with Mr. Mercedes, it was still a really interesting read and, you know, grounded in reality, no supernatural stuff, just about a series of books that are stolen from an author, and after a man gets out of jail, he goes on the hunt to try to find them and figures out who found them while he was in jail. So an interesting book, definitely. And then the one that I liked the most was Mr. Mercedes. I thought that this was fun, entertaining. It's probably one of the more gross, weird, yeah, a lot of weird, gross stuff happens in this book, and the killer is pretty interesting. I think this is my favorite, the Mr. Mercedes, of all the series. So there you have it. That's every book that I feel like you should read before Holly, if you decide to read any. That's my ranking of them. I'm really curious how you guys feel. I had a few comments of people who either did or didn't like the Mr. Mercedes series, so I'm really interested how you guys feel about any of these books, if you guys have read them, if you feel like you need to read stuff before Holly. I don't know, let me know. Let me know all your comments down below, and I will see you soon with another horror video. Thanks for watching. Bye.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear that the thoughts build up until I can't hear, that my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.